Okay, so I guess where I'd like to begin is just talking. We can't ignore the context of this interview, this event. I mean, normally we'd have been downstairs. There'd have been a crowd of 60 or 70 people that we squeezed into the shop. They'd be sitting on each other's laps. And of course, we're up here socially distanced in the library of the bookstore because we're recording this on July the 9th. We're just out of, we're 2 months almost out of confinement.
Almost 2 months.
But I'm still curious to know how it was for you. Were you in Paris?
I was very much stuck in Paris in the 11th arrondissement, where I've lived for 14 years. And this apartment is bigger than the initial apartment I lived in, which made the experience, slightly more tolerable. But no, I mean, we had nowhere, my husband and I had nowhere to go anyway. Nowhere else to go, I should say.
Unlike a lot of Parisians.
Unlike, surprisingly, a great number of Parisians.
20-25%, I think?
I mean, that's an astounding number, and yet it didn't surprise me. There are also a lot of people who fled to wherever they had friends who had homes. And I think that perhaps my sort of, not ease, because there was a moment of great discomfort when confinement lifted. But I do think that perhaps I'm living a little bit more normally now because I was here through it, and I, saw the different stages, and I didn't have to come back after 3 months away and feel panicked to the same degree. So I'm actually quite happy I stayed.
Is that something you've felt from sort of friends or acquaintances who were away?
Yeah. I have a few friends who are actually still away and have only come back, for an afternoon into the city, and they feel really nervous. To a degree, we should all remain nervous.
Of course.
But, we also need to try to figure out a way to navigate this experience. And I think that we have a slight edge, given that we were here. But I'll never forget this moment. I think Paris has had, in the last 5 years, so many unprecedented experiences. And I've, lived through, we both lived through all of them. And it really does change, or it does make me feel closer to the city in a lot of ways. I know some people are also thinking about, okay, they want to spend more time in nature, and they want, it has a different long-term effect. I kind of still feel anchored here and realize that there's a lot more to do, but I do also want to kind of escape every so often. So I think for me, it didn't change a whole lot, except that now I'm a cyclist.
Sure. Yeah.
So that's the biggest transformation.
And in a way, potentially you're a cyclist thanks to one of the people you interview in the new Parisienne. We'll come on to talk specifically about this person a bit later, I think. But it will be interesting, I think, to see how... Sorry, I will just pause for... I assume these are the warplanes coming in for the 14th
I think so,
July
or they're practicing or something.
Yeah.
It's quite...
worrying that they might need to practice.
I know.
So you mentioned sort of what Paris has been through in the last 5 years. Obviously, for people who don't live here, perhaps we should specify, of course, the Charlie Hebdo attacks, the Bataclan attacks,
flooding,
Notre Dame,
the pension reform strikes, the Gilets jaunes before that. It's been a very intense 5 years if you've lived in this city. And certainly different aspects of the city have felt that. Or certain neighborhoods have felt that more intensely. Of course, here at the bookstore, you have experienced it. And over where I live, I was about an 8-minute walk from Bataclan, less than an 8-minute walk. So, I'm right near where the demonstrations occur.
Of course.
On the Republique, it's okay. So it's just a maybe to some degree this is what people in different periods of time have experienced in a city. Lots of agitation, lots of moments of chaos. But I do think that it's been very condensed for Paris.
But that's interesting, like this sense of agitation and chaos, because it does sort of feed into a feeling I had when reading the New Parisienne, was that this sort of, maybe it's contributed to a certain loosening in Paris. Because at a moment in the book, you talk about Paris and France being a very conservative country. And this was one of the things I confess, like when I moved here all of 15 and a bit years ago, that was the thing that surprised me most about French society.
Learning that it was actually more conservative?
Yes, yeah. So there was a sense of, I came to France, I think a lot of Anglophones particularly come to France with a certain idea of what France is and what Paris is. And mine was very much informed by, the 60s, the sort of the existentialist kind of the philosophy, that sort of scene. And of course, this feeling of sort of Paris being a sort of a revolutionary city.
Totally.
And also being a city that gave us some of the world's most prominent feminist writers. And then to come to a city and to find that's not really encapsulated in everyday life was quite a surprise.
I think that was like a concentrated version of what I went through when I was working on this. It was like I was unraveling injustice that I knew was there. Mm-hmm. And then once I began, I couldn't stop unraveling it. And now it's all I can see almost, which is not a great place to be in, but I do still think there's a lot of hope. And the women who are perhaps the most vocal or the most committed to some of these issues themselves remain hopeful. So if they can, I feel like I have to as well. But it does mean that there's, it's very easy to take in one story, one side of a place. And that can be, in some cases, quite dangerous. The way that we allow ourselves to be informed about a destination. I mean, if everyone, looked at America as, for the current state of affairs, I mean, that's quite reductive, And so I think we all have to ask ourselves why Paris sometimes escapes this moment of challenging assumptions. It just lives on. The brand that it has become lives on, and so its people have almost become part of that brand. Unfortunately, for a big chunk of the population who don't fit what that sort of brand looks like, they're always sort of feeling like they don't belong.
And that's something, that idea of a brand, it's not just the city, but as you talk about, it's also the Parisienne, sort of women of Paris. And I've already confessed to you, when I see a book that is about that purports to be about a certain type of person, I'm immediately on guard. And as I said to you, I know your work, so I was quietly confident it wasn't going to be that type of book. But we also know that these kind of how to live life sort of genre of books sell really well. And then, of course, you reassure us immediately, not actually through your words, but from with I think possibly the first words in the book are from Rokhaya Diallo. Her quote about the need to reconstruct the image of the Parisienne.
So, I mean, the reality is that there are French women or women living in Paris who have felt this way for a long time, but nothing changes. And
for our listeners and viewers, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about that, what that brand of the Parisienne.
Okay, so if we think about, what some of the common, we can call them stereotypes or certain qualities that come up when we see articles discussing Parisian women or characters in films, and certainly in literature, not any recent literature, but, classic literature. It's women who are, the first word that always comes to my mind is a seductress. So someone who's very concerned with, sexuality and being sort of a temptress.
Sure.
She's also white. That, I mean, it's, regardless of the fact that it's no new reality that there are more than that there's a great diversity of women here, but in depictions she's 99% white, she's affluent, she's heterosexual, she's able-bodied. I would think she's also Christian or Catholic.
Skinny
and thin. Like that is the prerequisite. And so you have this genre that's been built around, well, like why is she the way she is? Well, then you have the books that will tell you, well, she is the way she is because of these philosophies of life, or the way that she eats and cooks, and all of it is trying to put her into this box that no one can aspire to, not even the people who live here.
Sure.
And yet, on covers of women's magazines, it's still the archetype, and unfortunately still in foreign media as well. I mean, so at once, what really struck me and sort of pushed me in the desire to do this book was, seeing the 100th article in foreign media about how French women, which are always, who are always conflated with the Parisian woman.
Course, yeah.
I'm sure that a Marseillaise does not consider herself the same. So, it's not you can't just copy paste.
Sure.
But so seeing the 100th article about that and how they do everything better. And I thought to myself, this needs to stop.
Yeah.
But then, very quickly I started noticing just how bad it is here.
Sure.
So the representation of women in French media, whether it's on television, in film, and then, of course, the women's magazines perpetuate the same kind of images.
That's quite unusual, I guess, in a way, for a sort of, it's not quite a national stereotype, but that kind of, because, I mean, often people would project onto, for example, the British man, we'll get in France, people will talk of bowler hats and umbrellas and suits, and it's that sort of traditional kind of city attire.
Right.
But of course, broadly, that stereotype is meaningless to most English people. And yet this image of the Parisienne, it seems to be sort of have quite a pernicious effect both abroad, but also in Paris itself.
Exactly. And that, I started to gather from, before I had started to work on the manuscript and before I was interviewing anybody, I was doing a lot of observation and online specifically and seeing reactions to some of these stories that would come out in France or, a certain panel discussion on television and seeing how people, specifically women, were reacting. And that's where I just started, again, once you start peeling those layers, you can't stop. And you really can just sort of dive into all the things that you probably were, aware of to some degree. If someone were to question you about it, you might say, oh yeah, it's true that this, coverage leans one way. But there are blind spots.
Yes,
and so once you start seeing it, it's all you can see. Yeah. And that's where I realized the extent to which women here felt extremely frustrated and hurt. I mean, it's like, when you think about how individuals develop their self-worth, we're used to seeing some semblance of ourselves represented to us. There are other ways in which I don't feel I'm represented, but those are not necessarily the most obvious ways. But a lot of these women, if they are from immigrant families, if they are, disabled, if they are gay or queer or however they might identify, you're looking at, never seeing themselves, and also realizing that people are happy for them to be invisible.
Sure. Yeah.
And that invisibility is problematic as well.
Because you can never really belong in a way, I guess. So that's one of the things that came to mind when thinking about that, again, that genre of like how to live like a Parisienne. Yeah. It's always how to live like. It's never sort of how to become. And one of the things that's very refreshing about your book is that, I mean, there are so many of the women in this book were not born in Paris. A lot of them were not born in France. And yet there's something, even though, and we spent a few minutes talking about some of the problems in the city, there's also clearly something about it which has allowed them to put down roots here and to make successes of their life.
Completely. I mean, it's sort of a paradoxical because it's a city where certainly there's the most opportunity in France, I would argue, and it is an extremely creative capital. The artistic and creative history of the city sort of lends itself to all sorts of new ideas. So sometimes it might be easier to sort of get in initially, but then ascending within that system is where it becomes challenging, or finding your belonging within that system. So, and I mean, I'm not, again, I'm also like you, we weren't born here. And Americans are usually pretty well received, at least in recent years. But that doesn't mean you belong either. I mean, there's always this like, suspicion, and when you think about where that might come from, it's like I think it goes back to what I talked about in the beginning, which is their sense of national identity. And it's like they know they have a global city. I think on paper they understand that that's an asset, but they don't behave necessarily or treat everyone as though this is part of a global a global vision for France in the bigger world. And that connects with the issue of universalism as well, and how. they've got these great ideals, but...
well, this was the thing I was going to just come on to talk to before we finally get around to talking about the specific women in the book, is that readers may be surprised when they open. You have your introduction, and then you have a cultural primer.
Yeah.
And I think probably one of the things that we, in the West anyway, lazily assume about other Western countries is that we're broadly on the same page culturally. And I mean, I think it's over the kind of the last few years, it's become increasingly clear, for example, to a lot of British people, how a lot of things in, for example, the United States work very, very differently, whether that be around healthcare or guns or things like that. And yet I think it's, a lot of people probably don't realize that there are certain fundamental values about the way not only society is run, but how certain issues are addressed in France.
And we're seeing that, I mean, this is sort of extremely timely, wasn't planned this way, but obviously in the last month we've seen an eruption of race relation movements and against police violence, and there's been a lot of pushback within the French elite, I would say, the French, even some of the, I would say, not even fully left-leaning, but sort of across the spectrum of political alliances, I've seen different remarks, or I've heard different remarks that have really stayed with me, which is this assumption that somehow we're importing an American, an Americanization of politics, of identity, and that I think is a way to say, well, we don't need to go in this direction because that's not our history, except the histories are actually quite similar. I think that was one of the things that sort of, with the women I spoke to in the book who have already made themselves experts in these areas. I mean, if you think about Rokhaya Diallo and a lot of the activists, they understand this history intimately. And what's interesting about this particular time is that finally more people are echoing sort of the alarm bells that they that they've always been ringing, and the government is still the government, or the elite or whoever is reacting with the denialism that we sort of have always expected. But it's getting harder to maintain. I think everyday voices are becoming louder, and I think that's what's interesting about this time is that when I spoke to Rokhaya about the issues she's constantly fighting against, and I think about how much she's trolled and vilified.
Well, let's talk about her particularly
So she's an anti-racist activist, a journalist, a documentary filmmaker, and there are other individuals who fight the same fight, but she is certainly the most media friendly, and she's on television, she's on radio, so her voice is widely known. But among
media friendly is an interesting way to.
I was going to say médiatisé. Which we don't say heavily mediatized. I mean, she's in the public. She's in the public eye.
Because I pick up on it just because there does seem to be a bit of a sort of attritional relationship between her.
You're right. I mean, I meant that she's media friendly in a sense that actually she's forever welcome on these platforms actually, and she handles herself with such grace and composure. And I say that because she is attacked left and right. She's never given a word in edgewise. She really has to fight to be heard. And what initially, just as I was watching, her fight fires on Twitter and on television before we spoke for the book, what astounded me was that none of her arguments seemed particularly controversial to me. Were she to be in the States, I don't think we would, most people wouldn't even be reacting. But again, she is the one who sort of highlighted to me this history of both denialism and amnesia. So it's like a willful amnesia. They choose to remember, the French, I say, they choose to remember abolition. They choose to remember very key aspects of their history, and leave the rest to be, relics of the past that aren't properly addressed. So they're not addressed in school. They're not addressed openly on television. So every time she brings them up as a reason for, these are these unaddressed and untreated wounds. It was still a collective trauma that was not actually properly handled, and is influencing or impacting the way people live their lives today. And so what she is essentially saying is that because this isn't even being handled now, there's a refusal to see the discriminations that exist and how that might be problematic for the people who feel continually oppressed. So just someone like that who, has to go to great lengths to make herself heard, and the heat that she gets in return is just still astounding to me.
Enormously disingenuous as well. That's the thing.
Absolutely.
I mean, the thing you mentioned earlier about this idea of, okay, that's not how we talk about things in France.
Yes.
As if sort of each culture is this sort of hermetic thing, as if sort of French feminism didn't then influence American feminism.
Exactly.
It hasn't always been this exchange.
And it's true. There are there's a context that is very different. I mean, as bad as things look in America, there is still much more open dialogue on these issues. It may make it may make a whole bunch of people uncomfortable, but it's not that this has never been out in the open. In France, it's almost like, we're trying to push through a door, and finally the door is creaking open. And yes, people are still uncomfortable and they're resisting this discussion, but I think this might be a moment where finally we don't close the door again. And it's not just, there have been other anti-racist movements in the past that have been hugely successful that, many people forget. I want to say it was in 1983, so I'm not sure about that date, but, there was 100,000 people turned out for this anti-racist demonstration all those years ago. And it's very easy for them to forget that this is not a new feeling among people. Now there's a great focus on, the Afro Black community, because, there are Caribbeans, there are Africans, there are, individuals of all backgrounds who are living in France. So it is a different sort of context than in the US, but it's sort of like the second wave, I think, of what needed to happen.
I suppose we should sort of just unpack that idea of why it's so difficult to talk about it in France. And I mean, so you one of the things in the cultural primer is this idea of communitarism, which I remember as 10 years as a language teacher, I never settled on a decent translation of that. I see you went for communalism, which is a word that I hadn't come across.
I've seen it in sort of referenced in a number of ways, but essentially, it's a pejorative way of referring to sort of multiculturalism. That's sort of the simplest.
Always pejorative.
Always pejorative. I mean, that's a simplistic version, but essentially, there's the idea. If in the States, or even I would imagine in the UK, if there's an embrace of different aspects of one's identity, that you could be Indian American, you could be Muslim American, you could be Jewish American, you could be African American, and still 100% American. And you can have multiple identities and still be part of sort of the same, national, be back in the same national vision. In France, it is you are French before you are anything else. And I do think, after speaking with lots of individuals who have very strong feelings on this issue, I do think that that's a really noble ambition. That everyone should be treated equally under the Republic, and that there is less of a need to distinguish yourself by these other traits. But in practice, it's not working. And then, because this is so protected and it is elevated as sort of the founding principle, if you do not, if you're sort of saying, but hey, wait a minute, I don't feel like I'm treated like I'm French, even though I'm born here, or my skin color isn't, porcelain white, where do I fit into this discussion? And that's where the resistance comes. Because then they're said to be sort of highlighting or not celebrating, but highlighting and putting emphasis on areas that shouldn't be part of the conversation, right? So if someone who is French Muslim and says, they start gathering in a Muslim community, trying to fight for their own rights or to be treated differently, that would be called communitariste, because they are gathering and being part of a group that is seen as a threat to the Republic. And so Macron has most recently said things, even in his national addresses, to this effect, where the biggest threat to the fight, the anti-racist fight, he says, is these sort of separatist groups, which I think is an incredible word for him to use. But he looks at this, these different groups or factions, as though, I mean, I think that's the way they look at them, as being a source of division within the country. And that's where I struggle with it, because, you know, it feels like this willful refusal to acknowledge what discriminations might exist.
Yeah. And it's also that, I'm going to use that word again, disingenuous, because, for example, when we talk about the treatment of women in French society, I mean, that's something that Macron was particularly vocal on before the election and soon after he was elected. But like, it doesn't seem to provoke a kind of cognitive dissonance to say women are completely equal in the eyes of the law, and yet it's clear that they are not treated equally with regards recruitment, with regards harassment in the street. That idea seems to be something which can at least be accepted. Now, we'll come on to talk about whether it's something which is appropriately addressed. And yet it just seems odd that a similar sort of logic could not be applied to when you're talking about race.
It's very easy for them to turn a blind eye. I mean, or just brush it under the rug. I mean, these are just painful issues they don't want to have to address, because I think they're afraid of opening that box. You know, it was, even with regard to the Jewish community, and even the fact that I'm saying community is like a very American thing, because they would never, you know, they really bristle at the idea of saying, you know, une communauté juive ou autre. They wouldn't say that because that's communitariste.
Sure.
But anyway, for the sake of this conversation, I'm going to say it. But you know, the virulent anti-Semitic, or sort of the measures in place to combat anti-Semitic behavior and speech, you know, that's essentially a result of needing to answer for the country's ills during the war. I mean, so it's not that they haven't done this in other ways. And so you're sort of, you know, if that's the thinking, if you take that issue extremely seriously, well, then you need to take all of them seriously. And that creates actually quite a lot of, I would say, frustration and anger within other aspects of the population. So I know this comes up in conversation also with some of the women in the book about how, you know, a lot of the French Muslims feel that, you know, they aren't given the same protections or concern to a degree as the Jewish community is offered. So the fact that there are, you know, armed guards in front of synagogues and in front of Jewish schools, but no such protections are really ever in place for their religious institutions and schools. You know, all of these are really sore points. And I think that, you know, it's understandable if you feel already ostracized within the larger community, within the larger, you know, national context, and you're seeing this sort of what could be construed as like preferential treatment, essentially. And so because the government doesn't fix this and keeps hiding behind or at least masking the issue with this idea of, you know, universalism, and we don't pull figures on race, ethnicity, and religion, et cetera, from the outside, it still looks like this is being done haphazardly. This is not an equal treatment. So fix it. You know, and that's essentially what these women are arguing. And I wouldn't say that they're all, you know, militant activists. You know, there's a chapter on activists, but
it's the first chapter.
It is
which is not accidental.
No. It's sort of start out strong, which is not to say that others aren't strong, but you know, I think it lays the groundwork for some of the biggest issues. And then what I think is interesting is how some of the other women throughout the book, without ever identifying as, you know, a hardcore feminist or, you know, a card-carrying anti-racist activist, they're expressing those same values or the same concerns on certain issues. And I think that was what was most fascinating to me was, you know, if you get them talking, if you get a lot of people talking, they sort of feel the same pain. And same desire to make things better.
It's interesting you say about not describing themselves as a hardcore feminist, because one thing that surprised me when I first moved here, and I think it has changed in the intervening years, but it's still an interesting, again, difference, I guess, with how things are in the Anglophone world, is the kind of an odd taboo around the word feminist. Which is sort of, you know, I would talk with people, and they were told that they'd be very quick to reassure you that they were not a feminist. You know, they might be campaigning for, you know, certain rights issues or something, but just to be clear, I'm not a feminist. There seemed to be this sort of almost militant sort of. Well, maybe you can explain it more.
Well, you know, I think that term globally was problematic for a time, and I think that's because, well, first of all, there's no one way to express one's feminism.
Sure.
I think that's one of the messages I really learned also from these women was that, you know, yes, there's still a dominant feminist ideology, which is universalist. What a surprise! This idea that all, you know, women, no matter what their background might be, they are all fighting against the same oppression, which just simply isn't true. So I don't identify with that kind of feminism. Yeah. Intersectional feminism, you know, which sort of takes into account all of the various oppressions that, you know, a woman might be facing simultaneously, and that needs to be taken into consideration when you're considering policy, when you're considering how far we still have to go, and the way that we gather. That feels still very much like the necessary focus within, at least within the French context. I think I remember reading articles with Lauren Bastide, actually, who's in the book, but with the UK press, and they had a little bit more resistance to the idea of intersectionalism, as though maybe they had moved on to some other form of feminism. But the point being, you know, I've named two sort of key categories of feminism, but, you know, there are people who don't identify with either, but still have their own beliefs. So the idea that there's this monolithic feminism is already sort of a problem. And I think that that's how it was perceived or communicated for a very long time. And then, you know, the press has done a very good job in the past of making it look like feminism or feminists were man-hating, right? And that's a really hard discourse to break, because actually feminists would almost all feminists would argue that what we're looking for is equality.
Sure.
And for that to be, you know, and for men to be involved in this as well. But, you know, you let the media do what they're going to do, and it's a very hard image to break. And I think that's part of it. I think that's why, you know, you might have conversations like that where someone says, but I'm not a feminist. I do think that's changing, though. I think because of, you know, the youth who are getting involved in these movements, because of social media. I mean, we can say what we want about all of its ills, but there's a real power in getting these messages out now and reaching young people who might not have, you know, actively taken an interest in learning about them, but you can reach them because they realize that they are concerned by those issues. And
certain ideas from around the world sort of arrive unfiltered.
Exactly. So, you know, if you don't necessarily, you know, if you're 15 years old and you don't read the newspaper, but you spend a lot of time online, well, that's a real opportunity to reach different voices and the young people who are going to carry this movement forward. So I think it's been sort of reappropriated, the word. And I was just talking with a friend of mine the other day who said he doesn't know that if he would call himself a feminist, but he's certainly pro-women and pro-feminism. So, you know, maybe there's like something in terms of branding that needs to be done, you know, for more men to realize that this is sort of everyone's battle. But I do think the taboo is starting to fade a bit.
Yeah, again, maybe connected to that sort of that social loosening, which you know, certain sort of dramatic or sort of revolutionary events can provoke.
Well, something has to make it happen.
It's difficult, I think, to talk about the sort of specific people in the book, because there's a lot of them.
Yes.
And each one we could talk about for about an hour. I mean, there's such sort of fascinating characters. They're all coming from different perspectives, different backgrounds. So there's a few that I'm going to shine a bit of a light on.
Please do.
But, you know, I just want to say to people listening that sort of this will, in a sense, be in no way representative, because it's such a sort of disparate selection in a way. But one thing that did strike me that unites a lot of the women in the book is the word "and." Like when you say what they do,
how interesting!
It will be activist and, you know, pâtissier or something like that. And it seems. Do you think there is something about sort of that does unite these women is that they're not just sort of focused on one particular activity. There's something sort of more, I don't know, maybe it's the struggle, maybe that's talking to you generally.
I have to say you're the first person to ask anything like that, and so it's an exciting question, because I don't know that I even realized that was one of the biggest links between all of them. But you're absolutely right now that you're saying it. I think, so there's an essay or sort of commentary section in the book about motherhood. And when I was digging into sort of, what makes the prospect of mothering or not mothering so different here versus elsewhere, it was this idea that does not make them women. Right. They don't suddenly lose the rest of their identity. And I think that connects with what you're asking. I think there's this sort of sense that, well, why would I need to be reduced to one thing? So interesting when you consider the way that the country wants you to just associate yourself with being French, but obviously we're much more nuanced, and we're much richer than that. And so you're right. I think there's this idea that, well, I'm never going to be just a baker. I have a past, I have a future, and I have opinions, and I want to be identified as such.
I wonder, this is going to be massively speculative, but just as you were talking, it made me think that I wonder if that idea, that kind of sort of division of labour kind of thing, that you can only be one thing and one thing well, is a very sort of, again, sort of Anglo-American way to think about it in a way, because, these were the countries that gave us sort of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism and that sort of, division of labour. And maybe, capitalism isn't something which has ever really fit with France. And I wonder if that's...
No, and I would also say that it's sort of, we know how much France likes to, put people neatly into boxes. Even us as foreigners, at some point we filled out a form and had to check one box, and, it doesn't quite work so well. And so this is almost like a way to say, well, I can't be put in a box. Don't try to contain me.
One of the women in the book that seemed to encapsulate that for me was Sarah Unraveling.
Yes.
So maybe you introduce her.
So she is a professional boxer. She won the Olympic silver medal in Rio after having competed in, I want to say, was it Beijing? I'm already now having, okay, so the year before.
She missed London, right?
Right, she missed London, and so Beijing, she unfortunately didn't qualify, or she didn't place. And, she was in her, I guess, late 20s, early 30s at that point, and, she was told that her career was over, essentially. She went to have a first child, and they said, there's no way you're coming back after this, due to, your body has changed too dramatically, you'll never sort of train enough to get back to your physical strength or stamina, and you'd be competing against young women who have not gone through something like that. And so she had to jump through, countless hurdles to even be taken seriously. And they did make her compete against sort of a young group of potential, of the boxers who were going to potentially go on to represent France. And she beat them. She really had to show them. And her feeling was like, women are always having to prove themselves. So this was just yet another example where I had to prove myself. But she trained, she said it was difficult, but that actually she found that, being a mother had changed her focus for the better. She had less time to train, and she was more efficient in that time, in that window. And I think there was probably a sense of, drive to show her daughter that she could do this.
Just that kind of analysis that you gave from that was sort of projected onto her was like, oh, you probably wouldn't be able to do it after what you've been through.
Yeah.
That just sounds... And I say this as a man, but you could hear a man's voice saying that.
It was 100%.
It's a similar thing to happen to Serena Williams, for example. Just this idea that there's something about motherhood which will then
that you are
physically incapacitate you.
Exactly, you are damaged goods.
Yeah.
And she was like, that is not going to be my story. And so long story short, she goes and competes, and she wins the silver medal. And in between, when she was training, she did go to get her master's and wanted to be involved in boxing in a different way and athletics in general. And so she does have her own boxing gym, which is great because there's a whole component where people who just want to learn to box as a hobby, there's a space where they can bring their kids so they don't have to worry about, trying to find care. I mean, it's supposed to be sort of a multi-purpose center, and getting companies to come in and have that experience together. And she's still on advising committees for, the Future Olympics, and also working toward greater diversity and parity in sports, because it is, unfortunately, the way she put it was just like, they'll put women on just to fill that box and have no intention of actually listening to them. And that's what we as women are sort of working against. It's like, we don't want to be we don't want to support tokenism. We really want things to change. So let us be part of that. But again, in sports, it shouldn't come as much of a surprise that it's still very much male dominated, even in the sort of management and advising level. And interesting that you bring up Serena Williams, because we talked during that interview about there were periods in boxing where there was a similar discussion as in tennis about the uniforms, and so
yes, skirts. I read that, my jaw almost hit the floor.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's absolutely astounding. And if you look today, again, Roland Garros and the organizers are the ones who are giving Serena Williams trouble about her what do we call those, like the ensemble that's also meant for her health, because she almost died during childbirth. There's it's supposed to be for circulation. But anyway, point being, controlling women's bodies is never ending. So in sports, you can see how that is amplified.
Just as a quick aside, you said she went and did her masters, and she went and did her masters at Sciences Po, one of the best sort of political business schools in the country as well.
Absolutely. I mean, she really gave her, and I also was really interested by her comment about, I asked her, when you were a kid, did you think you would do this professionally full time? And she said, well, it didn't feel possible, and up to a certain point, female boxers were not even allowed. I mean, there was a time, it's not that old of a professional sport. And so she's like, education still needed to be very much priority. I mean, also, you don't box until you're 60 years old, so you do need to have something to fall back on. But I think she had a certain sense very young that she was going to do more than one thing anyway. But this was a big passion, and clearly she had talent. And so that really struck me. And, that's what she's instilling in her children. And certainly what was interesting during confinement is she was almost every day posting sort of simple, medium level, medium difficulty, and intermediate workouts. That she clearly filmed from her home. But, just to say, like, you can do this, and even some that were meant for seniors. Which I think, I don't know, I think she's really trying to tackle fitness and well-being and how to sort of make that an integral part of your life without it, feeling intimidating.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the selection of the women, because obviously, I mean, there are people like her, also people like Anne Hidalgo or Leila Slimani, who people will have probably heard of and who have quite a public profile. And then there are other women who, I mean, the one that just comes to mind, who most people probably wouldn't have heard of, is the woman who runs La Maison des Femmes, Dr. Ghada Hatem Ganser.
Yes.
And I'm just curious about your process of selecting.
So when I started, I knew that I needed to cover a lot of ground. I needed this to be as reflective of the population as possible, still being, very inspirational to a degree. And one way of doing that was to try to incorporate as many professions as I could. That made sense. That wasn't going to make this into an encyclopedia either. And it was very important for me to get to include a doctor. And when I was doing some research about, doctors who have also done things, for women or women's rights, she was constantly coming up. And of course, now I see her everywhere. And, but this is now in early 2018, and I hadn't been as familiar with her. But then I started looking into her background and what she had already accomplished. I mean, it was extraordinary. And, I included, so her family justice center, which is called La Maison des Femmes, is in Saint-Denis.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that's part of Greater Paris.
Sure.
And that's why I included it, because, a lot of these women are from the suburbs, or they're from, or even now they live just outside of the city.
Mm-hmm.
And as there's been a push to make those sort of, those neighborhoods and those districts part of Paris, I figured that's how I was going to extend sort of the line. Mm-hmm. And so her center welcomes women from Saint-Denis who, in many cases, have been abused, have been victims of sexual assault and rape, who may not have access to contraception, may not have ever consulted a physician when it comes to reproductive health, and even some women who have been pregnant and never saw a doctor up until sort of late term.
Yeah.
It seems to me like it's almost the last hope for a lot of women. And so hearing her about her career and how she worked in maternity, and she'd been part of sort of women's journey at various stages, but this obviously is the hardest thing that she's done. And I don't, I try to put myself in her shoes and think about bringing home some of these stories, these horrific stories at night. And, her reaction was like, it is hard, but, I've now raised my kids, it doesn't interfere with that aspect of coming home at night. Yeah. And, now I can give my attention and my time to other people. So it was, just the sort of altruistic and very giving nature of this woman. You meet her and you just feel like you're in safe hands.
Yeah.
And not just, she has a team, but ultimately there's something that just struck me as so powerful about her. And also that she has to sort of raise all this funding herself.
Yeah.
And she's brought on some pretty big people to help with that. Ina Moja, who's in the book as well, has helped to raise money with her for the center. But I believe she's even had Juliette Binoche at one point. So there are a lot of high-profile women who are, showing their support for her work, and yet what really is needed is like sustained regional and municipal support. So
yeah, and it's interesting to send you mentioned sort of like this sort of the concept of power, and of course regional municipal support. It's probably actually the only thing in the book which is ever so slightly out of date, because we've recently had the municipal elections.
Yes.
Luckily for your book, Anne Hidalgo was re-elected.
She won, yes.
But you obviously you talk about the upcoming elections and the end of her first term, and now we're entering her second term. When we were talking about Rokhia Diallo earlier, you said about the sort of the vitriol that she received. I think probably alongside her, Anne Hidalgo probably received almost equivalent amount.
Treacherous. Her being one of those women on the internet is, and not just the internet, but being a woman in the public eye, and you're doing things that may be construed as controversial. Forget it. You're a punching bag, essentially.
There does seem to be a particular brand of hatred, I guess, reserved for women. Who speak out, I guess.
You see the same thing in the United States with AOC and the women, the young women of the House that were elected. Look at Hillary Clinton.
Sure.
These women are, and it's a particular hatred that we almost don't target to men. It's not the same.
No, it's not.
You're not going to, in theory, threaten on Twitter the lives of, a male senator's family, his children, and you're not going to say you hope he, something horrific, some horrific sexual assault will happen to him.
Yeah.
It's a particular breed of, just unabashed hatred.
Yeah.
And I can imagine how if you do not have a certain sense of composure, strong mental health, that could destroy you.
Yeah. And yet I was thinking when reading your interview with Anne Hidalgo that one thing that's been talked about during the recent pandemic is that it seems that countries run by women have tended to have fewer deaths and to manage the pandemic better. Now, I heard a journalist talking about the two possible interpretations of that, both of which, to a non-expert like me, seem quite pertinent. One is that sort of there might be something about the way that women as politicians operate that is perhaps more consensual, more compassionate than a lot of male politicians. The other one is that in order to become a high-ranking woman politician, you have to prove your excellence in a way that men don't. I know a lot of mediocre men become powerful.
Yep.
Very few mediocre women do.
I would say that both of those are probably true. I mean, she obviously was fighting during the pandemic or even during confinement for the government to allow her to reopen the parks. And, that's where it gets a little bit confusing as to who controls what, who makes which decisions in Ile-de-France and in Paris. It's not always what you think. So there's some hatred and anger that's directed toward her when it's actually, Macron. And we know that she and Macron do not get along. So it's not surprising that this was sort of like almost could have been a vindictive move of, no, we're not going to open the parks. Even though, for most of us living in Paris, it seemed like, so you would rather have people congregating closely on the canal and in places. So this was just after confinement lifted, but the parks were still closed. So, and she's saying it's hot because we did have a lot of that extremely warm weather. People are congregating closely. Why not let them go into the parks where they can spread out and they get air, etc. So, from a health perspective, it actually seemed to make quite a lot of sense, and they wouldn't let her. But she managed to do what we've now seen as, like a bike highway, adding 50 kilometers of bike lanes, and
which are going to stay, aren't they? Let's face it.
I mean, they are going to stay. Yeah, I don't think in her long-term strategy this was going to be okay, in September we're going to cover up those nice yellow bike paths that we've created. So what I think is problematic is that already you're in a position where people are going to be extra skeptical of you in these positions. But you also have to, hold your ground. You have to be committed. You have to have convictions. So it almost seems like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. But I do think that she is trying, and what doesn't help is when people don't really understand where she has jurisdiction and where she doesn't. And you see a lot of anger that's just completely misdirected because of that. But in this case, I think already the election, the municipal election, had 3 female frontrunners. So it's important for what that might signal in 2022. You've got very strong candidates who could potentially then run for president. And as we've seen, that trickled into a whole number of other cities in France. So it's not enough. But the fact that she won again, and that it's also, I think Paris at least needs someone who's thinking of these social services. I think that's good.
And I think in a way there's something interesting beyond the fact that she is managing the city. It's kind of her vision for the city, because there's a couple of people in the book. I think of her, and I think of Alice Cabaret, who are actually sort of concerned with how the city functions, and I guess particularly how it is for women to move through the city. And this is something which, again, has got quite a bit of press over the last few years about how safely, how sort of peacefully women are able to move through Paris or not. And to the point where there had to be ad campaigns pointing out that it's not okay to shout vulgarities to women in the street, that it's not okay to grab women when they go past you and things like that. And I thought it's sort of in reading about Anne Hidalgo and Alice Cabaret, I see just that idea of actually, there could be this could be the moment where there are some sort of structural changes to the way the city is organized and the way the city is designed. That could be particularly liberating for women.
I mean, I would say that, one thing that Alice Cabaret talks about a lot more is the issue of accessibility. And I don't think that has been improved upon enough since Hidalgo has been in office. So, she's made a lot of wonderful improvements, but there's some areas that still, to me, seem like
blind spots.
Huge, or just not priority when they really need to be. Because if you think about already, women like Elisa Rojas, who's also in the book, who talks about she can't freely navigate the city. So it really requires the infrastructure to be set up in such a way that she can at least have slightly more mobility within her. She's in a wheelchair, but the sidewalks are all you walk down the streets of Paris and you can see how there's no consistency in the material that's used for the sidewalks, and you don't have ramps.
And that seemed to be overlooked in the deconfinement as well. It's wonderful that restaurants have these kind of expanded terraces, but imagine if you're in a wheelchair, if you have a buggy, even these kind of
there's so it's an imperfect system right now, and there are clear improvements to be made. But that's where you have to ask the question. Okay, so you're having more women involved in some of these decisions, but is there an advising committee or consultants who might be able to feed in on the how difficult it is for the disabled? So there are things. She's not perfect. No one is perfect, obviously. But I would say that, there's a lot that I think I'm eager to see in her second term, and hope that improvements will be made. And I think probably having the Olympics in 2024 is a big deadline.
Absolutely.
Is a big goal for her.
Yeah. One of the areas I think that struck me where that a lot of the women you speak to sort of move in is the area of, I guess, new media and tech. It's quite a kind of a broad thing. I think of Laurent Bastide with La Poudre, and how she talks about how she essentially had, she was the editor-in-chief of Elle magazine, and because of the way the magazine was structured and the expectations of her, she essentially had to quit and set up her own production company, and now produces La Poudre, which is one of the best podcasts in France, in French, but also they have some episodes in English as well.
In English,
obviously, Rokhaya Diallo is a contributor and a presenter of several podcasts. There's Sarah Soke, the inventor of the Text a Day app.
Yeah.
And then Rahaf Harfouche, who I must admit, this is one thing, and this is my own tech illiteracy. I couldn't quite figure out what she does in tech. She seems to do something very significant and very important, but I couldn't quite figure out what it was. But I'm just curious to hear, do you think there's something in these kind of new media and the tech world, which we often think of as quite sort of dominated by kind of tech bros and things like that, where women, and particularly Parisian women, are finding some flexibility in space?
Yeah, I think perhaps it might even be slightly less of an intense bro culture than in Silicon Valley. And that might be because, the community is a bit younger here.
Sure.
And also the way that when it developed, there was a real emphasis on including women into the mix, and recruiting them. I mean, there are women engineers, there are women coders. And in France, you have programs for people to go and learn how to code. And then it helps also that with Station F, you have Roxanne Varza, who's the director, and brings, her expertise and her background to the table in a very visible way. So I think that also helps create a landscape where other women who are interested in these areas feel like, okay, I can actually, I can pursue these fields. I think it still remains relatively young. I mean, I think most of the women in these areas are under 40. So I don't know how, that's why I say I think it's a more recent phenomenon.
Sure.
But, the fact that Kat Borlengan, who is the director of French Tech, which is associated with the government, I mean, it is a governmental project, and she is not only, Filipino, female, has a background that's extremely diverse, and Reporters Without Borders, and she's been educated in Canada. And I think that what's good about the scene in Paris is that they're looking for people who have that international focus. And so a lot of these women match that and can offer that. Because as Kat actually talks about in the book, you want companies that are thinking globally first, not Franco-Français, and then they try to adapt. So, having leadership, whether it's her or having consultants like Rahaf who can come in and say, this is how you can actually take this and take it further.
That's what she does. Thank you.
Well, I mean, it's digital consulting. It's, I would say she's a thought leader in everything that involves, artificial intelligence and big data and just digital culture. So that might be the way we work within the digital space. But, all of them are bringing their expertise to companies and potentially startups who need to figure out how to make things work or grow. And so I think it's important that we have some of these women who are going to start showing the way for other women.
Now, I'm going to have to let you go quite soon because we've been nattering for about an hour now. I could go on 2 hours more because there's so much great stuff in this book. But two things that I think do need to be mentioned, and often, particularly in books like this, they often get overlooked. Of course, there's your words, there's the interviews, but there's also the pictures. And you worked with a photographer.
Yes.
Extraordinary photographer. I don't know if people can see some of the photos online.
They can.
Okay.
They can. There are some samples online, and even Abrams on the website, they have some photos, but also on my website, which is just thenewparisienne.com, I have some samples.
Okay.
Joanne Pye, she's Canadian and has been in Paris for about 6 years, and we were doing a lot of work together just for stories that I write, and we work very well together, and, she wouldn't mind me saying this, so I'm going to say it, but, she tends to work more in food and sort of the lifestyle space. And so I think this was also an interesting challenge for her to do a lot of portraiture. I knew she would nail all of the detail shots and the landscape.
Oh yeah,
Leila Solani's apartment was like the easiest space to shoot. So many really lovely details. But I had already seen the way Joanne would take photos of chefs and other individuals in the travel and food space, and I said, you can do this. And she's a very dear friend of mine, and so it was sort of like a no-brainer that I would want to do this with her.
And I don't know, so it adds so much to the book as well, just having this, not just portraits of the women and where they live, but sort of there feels this kind of, I don't know, this kind of coming together between your mind and her mind.
Yeah.
Sort of, it works in one sort of aesthetic, one sort of.
And I deferred to her when we were going on these shoots with the women as to what would she would know about them and their background, and so I would say, so how can we highlight her? You have to make her feel comfortable. You want it to be in a space that means something. So she was part of that creative process.
And the other thing I wanted to mention is the sort of, I guess, the sort of practical side to the book. So you have the interviews, but then you also sort of tap your guests or your interviewees for their favourite addresses in Paris and places like that. And what I'm just curious about why you decided to give it
that is more of a link to the first book as well, which is called The New Paris, and was not meant to be used as a traditional guide at all. It turns out people were using it in that way, and I wanted to sort of make it seem or sort of set it up as still being a continuing story in a way. And also, I think it's very interesting. I mean, I get the question a lot, where, are there women-owned restaurants? People are looking for that kind of information. And so this is a way also to have them contribute to the travel component. So it's not the first objective of the book, but I think people will find that there are some really great places to visit.
Some great addresses in there.
And even just, the outdoor spaces, the idea was not for them all to be new or super contemporary, but actually just how do these women live this city? I think that adds sort of an interesting element without having them to say it in that way.
And final question, is there anyone who's not in the book that you either tried to get into contact with and were unable to, or since you've written it, you think, I wish I could have put her in?
There are two women. One is Jacqueline Gompi, who founded Little Africa.
Okay,
and I just love her. I think her background is so fascinating, and she's doing such good work in the city and for the Afro-Caribbean community. And Shirley Sueño, who's a comedian, and she created the Barbès Comedy Club.
Okay,
So Jacqueline, I met after the fact. Or else she would have definitely been part of this.
Yeah.
Shirley, I tried really hard to nail down, and it was unfortunately didn't happen. But I'm fascinated by her career, and she performed on Netflix did this Comedians of the Universe or Comedians of the World series, and she represented France for that. She was one of a few comedians. And I just love that there's like a new wave of stand-up sort of emerging in Paris. All over France, but specifically in Paris, and that she also decided to open a comedy club. Where Jerry Seinfeld visited in January when he was in town. So he may have even performed. I would think that he performed, given that he doesn't understand French, so it would have been a bit complicated for him to just sit in the audience, but, so that's a big deal. So unfortunately, maybe one day I'll get to talk to her, but I'm fascinated by her work.
For the next volume, maybe.
Volume 2.
Now, Lindsey, I'm going to get you to sign our books.
Great.
I will have already plugged it to our listeners at the beginning of the podcast, but you're going to sign copies. So if you go to shakespeareandcompany.com, search for the New Parisienne, and we'll have signed copies available there.
Amazing.
For how long, I don't know, because it's already flying off the shelves, but maybe I'll keep inviting you back in to sign.
Happy to come by.
Wonderful. So, Lindsey, thank you so much for dropping by.
Thank you.
And speak to you again soon.
A bientôt.